I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Ngunnawal people, and to pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I'd also actually like to acknowledge Sharon, because a lot of what I'll be talking about in this presentation comes from a paper that we wrote together for The Lancet that was published just a couple of months ago. So it's a great honour and pleasure to be able to speak to you today. It's an honour because I'm fairly new to this field. I certainly don't have the long history in the trade and health area that many of the other speakers today have. And I think a little story that will illustrate that for you is that in the workshop that we've had for the last couple of days, Ron has very kindly brought over some smoked salmon from Canada as one of his contributions to the workshop, which was very nice. But I did spend quite a bit of time trying to work out what the symbolism of this was. Was it about trade? Was it about nutrition? And in the end, I settled on globalisation. So as Sharon mentioned, I convene a special interest group within the Public Health Association of Australia, and that's actually how I came to this issue of trade and health. And it was actually in the context of thinking about the Pacific Islands and the issues that Anne-Marie was talking about earlier around the import of fatty meat products. That's what first got me interested in the issues of trade and health, because of course Australia is actually negotiating a trade agreement with the Pacific Island countries as well. When I started reading up on the topic, I started hearing about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and this was around March 2011, I think. I became aware that some of the things that the US was suggesting for this trade agreement were quite outrageous in my view. The investor-state dispute settlement clause, which you've heard a little bit about already, and some very extreme intellectual property rights, for example. So I wanted to do something about this, and the first thing that I did was organise a roundtable discussion at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I rounded up as many public health people as I could and took them along. And I think at that stage it was my idea that I'd round up all these people and they'd suddenly get really active and start doing a whole lot of stuff. And actually that didn't quite happen that way, and I ended up doing a lot of the things I'd hoped other people would do myself. But it's great to see this sort of event happening, and that's one of the things that I've been trying to work towards over the last couple of years, to really get this dialogue happening between trade and health. And I have to say the DFAT negotiators have been very, very open and receptive to hearing about public health concerns and very easy to engage. So at that point, I think I'll get into my presentation. So I'm just going to give you basically the TPP 101, and I'm aware that there's a lot of people in the room who know a lot more about the TPP than I do. So what I'm really doing is speaking to the people who don't know very much about the TPP at all. So I'll just give you a brief overview of the negotiations to date, the sorts of policy areas and chapters that the TPP covers, talk about some of the areas of the TPP that might affect health, and I'm not going to do that in a very systematic way because there'll be other presentations that follow on from this one that explore the issues in a lot more depth. We'll take a brief look at the stakeholder groups and positions and focus on some of the key differences between the TPP and previous trade agreements, and I'll finish off with what the main concerns of public health advocates and academics are. So the TPP, as we heard this morning, began within the P4 agreement between Brunei, Chile, New Zealand and Singapore, which came into force in 2006. And the negotiations for the TPP started in March 2010 when Australia, Peru and the US and Vietnam came on board. The negotiations for the TPP very much need to be put in the context of the failure of the Doha round of negotiations for the WTO. And I think Sharon touched on this earlier, that regional trade agreements such as the TPP are emerging in the context of countries being unable to gain the terms that they want through the WTO, and that's both developed and developing countries. So we're seeing an increasing move to bypass the WTO through regional trade agreements like the TPP. The TPP is also intended to become a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So the intention is that more countries within the Asia-Pacific region will join up. The TPP has been hailed as a 21st century or gold standard free trade agreement that would break new ground and set high standards. And it's designed more as an economic integration agreement rather than a traditional free trade agreement, although it does include the traditional areas such as trade in goods and services as well. So it will also include non-traditional trade issues such as intellectual property, investment protection and regulatory cooperation. Now, sometimes people think that the US began this agreement, which isn't the case, obviously, with its origins in the P4. But of course, the US has taken quite a strong leadership role in terms of setting the agenda for the negotiations. And there's a lot of commentary out in the public sphere suggesting that the TPP, the US sees the TPP as a means of restoring its economic power in the wake of the global economic crisis. So to some extent, the agreement is probably more about politics than it is about economics and trade. So there's probably some political positioning going on as well in terms of the US staking a claim in the Asia-Pacific region. So the TPP countries currently negotiating, Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, the United States, Vietnam, and of course the list gets longer every time I give this presentation. Japan has just recently joined and will be probably sitting at the negotiation table, not at the next round of negotiations, which is next week, but probably the one after that. Some countries are also discussing the idea of joining, and although none of these countries have formally expressed interest yet, it's quite possible that they may decide to join in the near future, particularly Thailand. So the significance of the TPP goes well beyond the countries that are already negotiating. It's likely to expand to include more countries across the Asia-Pacific region, including more developing countries. The TPP countries already represent almost 10% of the world's population, and they include some of the biggest economies in the world and account for more than 30% of the world's GDP. And the region covered by the TPP is said to represent 40% of global trade. So the TPP is quite a fascinating arrangement because of the geographic spread of the countries. In a way, it's not really a region because of the way the countries are spread, and also the differences between them, including different levels of development. So the TPP obviously includes some quite wealthy countries with per capita GDP above 60,000 and as low as under $1,500 per person. So, but unlike at the WTO, all of the participating countries will be expected to comply with the same standards regardless of their level of development. So to date, there have been 16 rounds of negotiations concluded, and the next round is starting next week in Peru. And the TPP countries have set a target to conclude the negotiations in 2013, which is, it may seem that, because the negotiations started in 2010, that's quite a long period of time. But actually there are a lot of very highly sensitive issues that haven't been resolved yet in the negotiations, including a lot of the issues that we're very concerned about in the health sector, things like access to medicines and investor-state dispute settlement, for example. And one of our concerns is that with a target to conclude the negotiations this year, that some of those sensitive issues may not be resolved until there's pressure to conclude, and they may become political decisions that are made rather than made for sound policy reasons. So the negotiations take place under conditions of confidentiality, and no draft text is made publicly available. What we know about the US agenda for the trade agreement very much depends on some leaked draft texts that we have access to. Some of those are quite old. I'll show you those in a few minutes. So while there is room for the public health community to be involved, there's not a structured process for input. So it very much depends on stakeholders, like the Public Health Association, going along and saying we want to talk about these issues that we're concerned about. But because we don't have access to the full text, we have a limited range of issues that we know to be concerned about in the first place. So there are opportunities for stakeholder involvement at the negotiating rounds, and I've been to 3 stakeholder events at 3 negotiating rounds now. There are usually opportunities to give formal presentations to the negotiators. There are stakeholder briefings by the chief negotiators from all the countries, and sometimes there are opportunities to mingle more informally with the negotiators. There are domestic consultation processes, and DFAT a couple of times a year, I think it is, they do go around to the capital cities and hold consultation sessions, and there's a round of consultations coming up soon towards the end of May and in June, so perhaps our DFAT colleagues might tell us about that afterwards in case people are wanting to be involved in that. But as I said, meaningful input is quite difficult in the context of not having access to the text and being reliant on outdated drafts of text that's been put forward by the US. And as a couple of other speakers made the point this morning, that US industry advisors have access to the US negotiating texts and strong influence over what goes into them. Now this is just a list of some of the policy areas and chapters in the TPP. This is not an official list, I've just sort of put this together from different sources. And what you can see the spread of different topics that are under discussion in the TPP. And what I've done here is I've put in bold some of the chapters that we think may have a bearing on health. And in bold and red, you can't really see that it's bold, but the ones in red are the ones that we're particularly concerned about, particularly from when we think about medicines and tobacco particularly. So we're going to talk in much more depth in the next lot of presentations, the panel discussion about the TPP and health. But I just wanted to flag some of the issues that we're concerned about. There are, of course, some potential benefits that the TPP could bring for health. Economic growth in the TPP countries could lead to increased GDP and higher incomes and better living conditions and therefore better health. But I think this morning we heard from other speakers that there are some conditions around whether economic growth does lead to better health. We don't necessarily have a strong evidence base for showing that that's actually the case, and even when that does happen, it's not always evenly spread. So it's often, there's often an assumption that trade agreements will lead to economic growth and therefore to better health, but that's often an unexamined assumption. In terms of risks, some of the things that we're most concerned about are reduced access to affordable medicines. We're concerned about the availability of health-damaging products like processed foods, alcohol and tobacco, and more generally about restricted policy space for health, which Anne-Marie talked about quite a bit this morning. So what we're talking about there is the flexibility that governments have to actually use the full range of policy options that they might want to use to address health issues. So, and this is particularly important in the context of rising rates of non-communicable diseases, where governments are starting to realise that they need to take a stronger role in regulating industry around things like the sale and marketing and advertising of health-damaging products. So the TPP could have an impact in all of these areas. And of course, as we heard this morning from some of the other speakers, there can also be many other indirect effects through the social determinants of health. And there are many things that we don't know about the TPP, and we can't necessarily predict the effect that it's going to have on those social determinants of health, but they certainly need to be part of the discussion. So what do we actually know about what's being proposed for the TPP? as I said, we're very reliant on leaked negotiating documents, particularly some US proposals that were leaked in 2011, and I've listed them there. So the first one is some text drafted by the US for the intellectual property chapter of the TPP. So this text shows that the US is seeking to extend the intellectual property rights of pharmaceutical companies. And MSF, the humanitarian organisation, has warned that if the US proposals are adopted, that this trade agreement could be the most harmful ever for developing countries because the intellectual property rights are so extreme. There's also an annex to the transparency chapter of the TPP proposed by the US that would impose restrictions on the operation of pharmaceutical coverage programs like our PBS in Australia and New Zealand's PharmAC. There are TBT annexes to the technical barriers to trade chapter that would affect regulation of pharmaceuticals, medical devices and cosmetics. And there was also some text leaked for the regulatory coherence chapter, which Jane Kelsey has done a lot of analysis on. I haven't really looked at that very specifically myself, but it seems to give a much stronger role for industry in government policy making. In 2012, the draft investment chapter for the TPP was leaked, and that shows that being discussed in the TPP is a very strong set of investor rights, including a very broad definition of investment and investors, and an investor-state dispute settlement mechanism that provides corporations with an avenue to sue governments in international tribunals for introducing or implementing policies and decisions that affect the value of their investments. And Matthew's going to talk to us in a little while about the way that type of clause has been used in the context of tobacco plain packaging. This text showed that Australia is seeking an exemption to the investor-state dispute settlement clause, which we're very happy about, and that position seems to be maintained to the current date. There was also, in 2012, the US released a summary of a proposal on tobacco for the TPP. And while there's no specific legal text that's been released, that's been very contested. It's sort of a compromise position between the interests of the tobacco industry and public health objectives. So I don't think there's anyone who's particularly happy with that proposal, and the US doesn't seem to have actually tabled the text for that proposal in the negotiations, probably because there's so much unhappiness about it. There were also reports earlier in the year of an annex to the Technical Barriers to Trade chapter about the disclosure of proprietary formulas. And so this could prevent the governments from actually requiring companies to disclose quantitative information about the amounts of ingredients in food products. So it could place limits on the information that food manufacturers are required to disclose both to regulatory authorities and also to consumers on food labels. So we'll hear more about these issues later on. So I just wanted to talk very briefly about the different stakeholder groups and positions that are being advanced in relation to the TPP. So obviously there are a lot of industry corporations and industry associations lobbying governments about what they want in the TPP, including the pharmaceutical, tobacco, food and alcohol industries. Of course, there's a lot of variation in terms of what they're asking for, but the general thrust of the sorts of things that industry is asking for is better market access in the other countries, the removal of trade barriers, integration of supply chains, strong intellectual property rights and strong investor protections. And that's, of course, what we're seeing reflected in the text that the US is tabling in these negotiations. There's quite a strong civil society movement as well, internationally and in Australia. And there are a lot of unions, fair trade and consumer organisations, and health NGOs and development NGOs associated with that, as well as academics. In Australia, obviously, the Public Health Association has been very active, and we also work with a number of other health organisations around the medicines issues, including the Australian Federation of AIDS organisations, the Palliative Care Australia, and a few other organisations on those issues. And we also work with our counterparts in other countries as well. So depending on where those organisations are focusing, some of them are concerned about specific issues, such as tobacco or medicines, and some are concerned about the agreement as a whole and the negotiation process and the issues around transparency. So I just wanted to flag some key differences between the TPP and previous trade agreements, and Sharon touched on these this morning. So it really does extend beyond the traditional trade issues, and it's sort of, this is part of the rhetoric of the TPP as well, that it does go further than previous trade agreements. So the proposals that we're seeing are for strong intellectual property protections, strong investor protections, things like regulatory cooperation. So it extends further behind the border into domestic policy making than previous agreements. There are also big imbalances in economic and negotiating power between the different countries. And of course, the corporations have disproportionate power, and I think Peter Drahos illustrated that very well for us this morning in terms of the input that they have to the text that's actually discussed in the negotiations. The TPP, bilateral and regional trade agreements generally, including the TPP, don't have the same accountability and transparency mechanisms that the WTO have. So that adds another issue. So just to conclude, and then I think we can get into the more specific issues, the TPP presents new and great challenges for public health. So there are some specific risks to health in terms of access to affordable medicines, the availability of health-damaging products, and more generally, the erosion of policy space to protect health. There are also risks to health equity because the benefits of the agreement may not be equally shared, and disadvantaged groups or countries are most at risk. If we think about something like access to medicines, which I'll talk a bit more about later on, it's when medicines become less affordable, it's groups that are already disadvantaged within countries that are most affected, and it's developing countries that are more affected than richer countries. The TPP is also a concern for us because it sets a new global standard, and we've seen historically that a sort of ratcheting up effect in trade agreements where each previous trade agreement becomes the template for the next one, specifically when it comes to US free trade agreements. And just to finish up finally, I think it's really crucial for the public health community to actually engage with trade policy issues. And it's great to see such a diversity of people in the room. I think we can't leave this to the experts. We can't leave this just to the trade negotiators. We need to make sure that we are really raising these issues and getting them onto the agenda in the trade negotiations. Thanks very much.